All right, guys, we're going to start with the normal CT of the skull, which you guys have a link in the course. And we'll go over the anatomy really quickly, the bony anatomy that you would have to know for the test, and in which plane you should know it. So starting in the axial plane, which is kind of hard, but I'll show you guys how you can see the different bones as you scroll through. Easiest thing, I think, is to go right to the top of the skull and start looking at the sutures, okay? So we've talked about the sutures. The coronal suture right here runs transversely, separating the two parietal from the frontal. And then what separates the two parietal is the sagittal sagittal suture right here. So frontal and parietal right off the bat, easiest thing you can do. And then follow that down, frontal, and then your two parietal. And then eventually there's going to be another suture coming in over here, which is kind of hard to see. But I'll show you where it's going to start to come in kind of here. And that's where you have your temporal lobes coming in. Temporal lobe. You can definitely see that there's a suture here, suture here. That's your lambdoidal suture that separates your temporal from your occipital bone. Okay, so I would ask you pretty easy ones. You definitely need to know the sutures for sure. Squamous, which joins the temporal bone with the parietal, which is the hardest one to see when you go all the way up. It's kind of coming in here. You can kind of see it a little bit here. Definitely you can see the sagittal suture. Definitely when we go all the way to the top, you can see the coronal suture running transverse, and then the sagittal. And then the lambdoidal in the back, for sure, separating the parietal and the occipital right here. So bones of the cranium, which we've talked about, 8 bones, the 2 parietal, 1 frontal, ethmoid bone, 1 sphenoid bone, 1 occipital, and 2 temporal bones. Okay, so again, starting all the way at the top. Here's your frontal, here's 2 parietal, come down, still frontal. We're now into temporal bone, and occipital bone. Down here, sphenoid is in the central portion. Here's your mastoid, which you know is part of your temporal bone, but just medial to that, here's your sphenoid. Okay, in here, sphenoid. This is all part of the sphenoid. Sphenoid, 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 sphenoid. There. Okay, sphenoid in here. Ethmoid. See your ethmoid here. And that's it. So those are the bones of the cranium. Divided into 3 fossa. This study here, I can't quite show you because it's just not quite in the right plane. But we know that the anterior cranial fossa is separated by the lesser wing of the sphenoid, the frontal bone, ethmoid, and contains all the frontal lobes of the brain. So if we were in the right axial plane here, it would be up here. And then the middle cranial fossa, formed by the body of the sphenoid in here. The temporal bones over here. Okay, and that's going to contain the pituitary, the thymus, hypothalamus, and the temporal lobes of the brain, which we'll talk about when we get in there. But just looking at the sphenoid bone, so first thing I want to point out, here's your sphenoid in here. This posterior clinoid process. Here's your anterior clinoid process of your sphenoid bone, okay? And then what sits just in between here, okay? That's your sella turcica, and this is inferiorly your dorsum sella. And then your pituitary is going to sit right in that little pocket there. All right, so you do have to know that. Axial is probably the hardest to see on of the sphenoid, but you know the sphenoid is just posterior to the ethmoid, okay, sphenoid. Look for this central guy here, your posterior clinoid process. As you travel down, it's going to join up and form this little seat, the sella turcica, and then the inferior portion, your dorsum sella, okay? And then these two little wings coming off here, right there, your anterior clinoid process of your sphenoid, okay? So you do have to know them. Let's look at a different, oh, this is only axial in this, sorry. We'll look at, when we look at the facial bones, we'll pull that up again. Foramen. So now let's go to the foramen that you have to know. Obviously the big guy, which is, this is again kind of an off plane, but your foramen magnum is in here. Okay, so that's foramen magnum, big one. Foramen ovale. Is your foramen ovale right here. Foramen ovale right here. This is spinosum, which you don't have to know, but just as an FYI. Foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. Jugular foramen is the big guy right here. So I kind of look at the most inferior portion of the occipital bone just before it joins with the C1, and then you look for this big guy right here. Okay, big guy. This is kind of off plane on this one. Jugular, jugular. Just anterior to that is your carotid canal. And why it's called a canal is because first you can see how it's a nice round circle, and you can imagine the carotid artery heading up in there, and then it actually becomes a canal, all right? So there's your canal. So think about the carotid coming up, so it's like coming straight at you, and then eventually it's going to turn and travel more anterior, more on a horizontal plane, right? So there's your carotid canal. What else? What are the other ones? So those ones you have to highlight: foramen magnum, foramen ovale, jugular foramen, optic canal, and then the EAM, pretty easy. Mastoid air cells just anterior to the mastoid air cells. You have this air coming in, that's your EAM. Okay, right there. On this side, just anterior to the mastoid air cells, EAM, right there. Okay, and then now the only other thing we have to find is the internal auditory canal, which if you just go a few more slices up, this is it right here. Internal auditory canal right there. Okay, and you can see in here, I'll show you, if you follow the EAM, come into the EAM, you're going to see these little dots just medial to the EAM. All right, EAM dots. Okay, that's your inner ear. Those are like your ear bones. Is it the malleus, the conchae, or I'm sorry, cochlea is in there. And then if you look at that, look just posterior to that, there's your internal auditory canal. And it should make sense because this is where the nerves are going to head up into the brain and allow you to actually interpret the hearing, that the noises that these bones in the inner ear are interpreting. So those are the foramen that you have to know. Let's move on to, do we cover everything in this cranium? Yes. Let's switch over to the facial bones. Up here, facial bones. So this is the axial facial bones right here. Okay, so let's start low. I think that's going to be the easiest for you guys. So facial bones, we have the 14 bones that make up the facial bones. Nasal bones, 2 lacrimal, 2 palatine, vomer, 1 vomer, 2 maxilla, 2 zygoma, 2 inferior nasal concha, and the mandible. So the ones that you do not need to know, well, you have to know that they exist and are facial bones, but we're not going to be able to point them out on a CAT scan or an MRI. We're not radiologists. They're very hard to see. The 2 lacrimal bones, the 2 palatine bones, I can show you where the vomer is, but you don't need to know that for a test. So you do need to know, so highlight, put a star next to the 2 nasal bones, 2 maxilla, 2 zygoma, 2 inferior nasal concha, and the mandible. So first we have mandible. Here's your mandible coming in, okay? Mandible bone, mandible, there's your teeth coming in. Your mandible is then going to, remember, as the mandible travels superiorly, it's going to split, kind of, and become 2 separate parts following the mandible. The anterior is your coronoid process. Okay, so there's your coronoid process coming off your mandible. And then the posterior part is eventually going to come up and become your mandibular condyle. All right, and that's going to articulate with the temporal bone for make your TMJ joint right there. Okay, so there's the coronoid process of the mandible and the mandibular condyle. What else? Let me look here. The inferior nasal concha right here. Okay. The maxilla. Let me get in the right plane here. Well, easy ones I can show you. There's the zygoma. Zygoma attaches to the maxilla right here. There's your maxilla. And then if we go all the way up, nasal bones are going to come in up here. Nasal bones. Up in here. Nasal bones. Okay, so those are your nasal bones. 2 nasal bones, maxilla, zygoma, 2 zygoma, right there, and mandible, right here, mandible, and the inferior nasal concha, right here. All right, so those are the facial bones that you have to know. In this plane, let's go to coronal. They're much easier to see in the coronal plane, I think. So anterior, here's your nasal bones right there. Easy to see. Here's maxilla, 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 maxilla. I know I say that funny. Here's your mental protuberance of your mandible. Mandible going back, back. Okay, the first process, the anterior process, superior process of your mandible is your coronoid. And then as we travel posterior, the posterior process are your mandibular condyles right here, your TMJ joint, right there. Okay, and then coming off of the maxilla, the maxilla right here is going to be your zygoma. There's your zygoma coming off anteriorly, traveling posteriorly. Okay. Inferior nasal concha right here. The vomer is in here. And then your palatine and your lacrimal bones are in posterior and back in here, which again, you don't have to know. You have to know them, you don't have to point them out. All right, so we have mental protuberance you have to know. Mandible, you need to know the 2 processes, coronoid and the condylar process or the mandibular condyle. Inferior nasal concha, your nasal bones. The EAM we can see in this plane. Here's EAM, EAM. Oh, we can look at the sphenoid now. Here's sphenoid. Okay, and if we go anterior, here's your anterior clinoid process right here. And then travel posterior. And then we have that space, right? That's where your sella turcica is. in there, and then the posterior dorsum sella, and right here, posterior clinoid process. Okay, dorsum sella, sella turcica, anterior clinoid process. Okay, so you can see that we went through zygoma, zygoma here, coming off the maxilla in the coronal plane, EAM, inferior nasal concha, right in here. And then this is your jugular foramen here. Jugular foramen. And then now we need to talk about sinuses. So traveling all the way interior, the sinuses that you need to know as well. The maxillary are the easiest right here. Maxillary sinuses. Your frontal sinuses, other easy ones to see right here, frontal sinuses. Interesting, this is your nasolacrimal duct right here. That's how your tears get down into your nose, if that ever happens. That's how people have that. Some people do milk coming out of their eye. That's the weird way they can do that. Weird people. Here's the, okay, frontal bone, or frontal sinus rather, and then in here, now not all of this are ethmoid sinus, okay? Ethmoid sinus is only, if you look for the bullae, right here, the big guys, right medial, just medial to the orbits, this is the ethmoid sinus right here, these little guys here, okay? Bullae, then you have like the infundibulum and the ungulate process in here, which you don't need to know, but so there's that, and then maxillary sinus, and then all the way posterior, here's your sphenoid sinus right here. Okay, so you do need to know them. And last but not least, as far as the bony structures go, is the orbit. So we get into the orbit. We have the medial wall, we have the lateral wall, we have the roof of the orbit, and the inferior, or the floor of the orbit. Okay, and remember I said in lecture that if you have what's called a blowout fracture, okay, so you can see how there's just this teeny bit of bone that separates the floor of the orbit from the maxillary sinus. So if there's a fracture of this bone here, okay, fluid can go down into the sinus. So a clear sign of an orbital fracture would be fluid collecting down here in the maxillary sinus underneath the orbit that's fractured. So if you have both orbits fractured, you would have fluid in both of them. And then if it's just one, you would have fluid in one and not in the other. Now, having fluid in the sinus is not necessarily an indication that there's definitely a fracture, because they could just have fluid in their sinus. But when you have someone who comes in and you're doing a CAT scan and they have this hugely swollen eye, and they were punched in the eye, or they fell and hit their eye, and they question a fracture, and you see fluid in one and not the other, chances are there's an orbital floor fracture, or what we call a blowout fracture. So remember, the lateral wall of the orbit is it's the medius, it's the thickest of all of them. The medial is the thinnest, okay? And then inside here, it's your you're going to have your space for your lacrimal duct right here. And then I want to switch over to the axial and just show you the orbit from an axial view. Okay, so here's the orbits in this axial view. Okay, here's the posterior portion of the orbital wall of the orbit, and then here is your here's your eyeball in there. But see this meaty guy right in the center here coming down? That's your optic nerve. Okay, so when we start going over brain and we start talking about the optic nerve and the optic canal, this is a really good, clear picture of it. Okay, optic canal. And then you have your, it's going to connect into your nerve is going to connect into your optic canal, and then eventually it's going to head straight back and connect with your optic canal and travel right back into the specific area of the brain that receives signals. The optic chiasma receives the signals from the optic nerve, which allows you to see. So you have your optic nerve here. This is a muscle. If we go superior, this is actually the lacrimal duct, this kind of like grade. You can see it better in the right eye than the left. See this density up in here surrounding the lateral border, the superior lateral border of the orbit? That's the lacrimal duct. All right, so that's, lacrimal gland. So that's what generates the tears, and then it would travel down to your lacrimal duct, which allows it to release inferior in the eye. So the inferior orbital fissure is this guy right here, which eventually turns in a different direction, travels straight back, and becomes the optic canal, and then communicates back to the optic chiasma, which we're going to talk about next week when we go over specific brain structures. So those are the bony structures you have to know. So let's switch out of these and switch over to our normal MRI of the brain. First thing I want to show you about the normal MRI of the brain. We're going to talk about gray matter and white matter and all of that stuff. Now, with MRI, this gets a little confusing. So I don't know if you need to write this down like on a sticky note so you can reference it when you are studying. But if you look at this, they have different titles: axial flare, T1, T2. All that is it's a different way of doing the specific MRI scan. And if you want an excellent explanation, ask John. But basically the gist of it is it's how it's receiving the signal, and then how it receives the signal of whether it's fat or whatever within that area of the body, it displays it a different color on the screen. So this is an axial flare, which again, don't ask me exactly how that works or whatever. All I know is when you look at an axial flare or you look at a flared image, the gray matter and the white matter are actually swapped in color. So this is actually the gray matter all out here that's shown kind of a lighter, almost a whiter color. And then in here, this is actually the white matter. Okay, and I know that's confusing and I'm sorry, but that's how MRI works. And I don't have a really good study that's this detailed that has it displayed in the appropriate colors, I guess. Like when you think gray matter, you want to see gray, and when you think white matter, you want to see white. And in a lot of ways, like when we switch over to the T1, that's the case. Okay, so see gray matter all out here, white matter internal. The corpus callosum is actually white, it's white matter. Okay, so it makes sense when we look at it in a different projection. But as far as the axial goes, when I start discussing axial anatomy on this particular study, the T2, it's crappy. It's not easy to see the anatomy on the T2. This SWI, again, who knows? I have no idea what that means. It's not very clear to see the distinct anatomy, and there just isn't. Axial MIP doesn't look really good. It's not easy to see the anatomy. So unfortunately, I have to show you the axials in this flare. Okay, so just again, write down on a sticky note that the actual coloration is opposite on the axial flare. The T1 and the sagittal and the coronal that we're going to reference, the gray matter is gray and the white matter is white. So when we look at the splenium of the corpus callosum here, and we start looking at the dentate nucleus, it actually is the appropriate color of what it's supposed to look like. Okay, dentate nucleus right in here. Internal, external. All right, so now that we've had that discussion, let's start pointing out some anatomy. So let's switch back to our axial. All right, so first and foremost, we have different lobes of the brain. 4 mutually agreed upon lobes but most people say there's 5. Okay, so we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, the temporal lobes, the occipital lobe, and then the 2 insular lobes. And the insular is kind of considered the 5th lobe of the brain. So frontal lobe, most superior and anterior portion, right here. Okay, the most posterior and inferior is your occipital lobe, are your occipital lobes. The most inferior lateral are your temporal lobes. All right, and then somewhere up here, the frontal lobe and the parietal lobes are separated. Okay, and this is where that kind of confusing thing where I talked about the mustache and watching the YouTube in the lecture, I'll show you exactly what he meant. So go up to the top of the skull, go to the apex of the skull, and now start traveling down. And I want you to look in the posterior aspect of the brain, just to the lateral aspect, I guess, of the longitudinal fissure. So here's your longitudinal fissure, your main fissure right here. Okay, separates your brain, your cerebrum, into right and left hemispheres. Okay, so longitudinal fissure. We know that there's a couple other fissures in here. There's the lateral fissure. There's a sulcus, a cingulate sulcus, central sulcus. We know that there's different things in here. We're just not quite sure exactly where they are. So we know, again, kind of, let's just rewind a little bit. The folds of the brain, so here's a fold right here. Here's a fold, here's a fold, 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 fold. That's the gyri, okay? It's the gyri. These indents, okay, these little indents here, those are your sulci, okay? Those are your little indents. And then when you see these bigger indents, like look at this big indent. Ooh, look at that guy. Big indent, big indent, big indent, okay? Big indent. That's a fissure, okay? So those are your deep grooves or your fissures. Your shallow grooves or indentations are your sulci, and then the spaces between the folds of the cerebral tissue are your gyri. All right, so again, rewind. Back to looking for the difference, what separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So we want to travel down, and you want to look down here, and what we're looking for is the cingulate sulcus, okay? The cingulate. How do I find that? Who knows, right? You want to look for a mustache. You want to look back here in the posterior aspect of the brain, just lateral, just coming off of the longitudinal fissure, and you're going to see this kind of mustache here, okay? Here's your mustache. Here's your mustache, mustache, mustache. And then what you want to do is once you find this mustache, you want to go up and to the left, and then up and to the right of the cingulate sulcus, or sulcus, and you're going to find the central sulcus. See this long sulcus here? Okay, not quite a fissure, but it's a pretty long groove there, okay? Here's your right side, up and to the left, central sulcus, okay? The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, okay? So up to the top, go down, look to the lateral aspect of the longitudinal fissure, cingulate sulcus, up and to the left, up and to the right, there's your central sulcus, okay? And he's actually got a really easy one that you can actually follow it up one more slice, okay? Cingulate sulcus right here. And now that I know where my where my central, this is my central, this is cingulate, this is cingulate. Once I find where my central sulcus is, I now know that the fold just anterior to my central sulcus is my precentral gyri, and the fold just posterior to my central sulcus is my post-central gyri. Okay, this is frontal, so this is your motor cortex, motor groove right here, and then this is parietal, so this is sensory. Okay, motor, sensory, pre-central gyri, post-central gyri. All right, so I know it probably seemed like super confusing and oh my God, am I ever going to know this on the lecture? But I hope I made it a little bit easier to see. And I hope you get a little bit of an appreciation of just how complex the brain is. It seriously is amazing how these little things you never even thought, I mean, they tell you, okay, teeny little millimeter right to the left, having brain surgery can cause paralysis or loss of speech or whatever. But it really kind of now you're seeing for sure how that happens. I mean, look at how small the distance is between the pre-central and the post-central gyri. And just this little teeny fold of the central sulcus separates the two. If I'm doing brain surgery, oop, now I've lost sensory function. Oop, now I've lost motor function, just a matter of millimeters away. All right, so that is the first part. Again, let's go. Looking for the central sulcus, there are ways, don't YouTube it, but there are ways to see this in a coronal or a sagittal view. You don't need to know that. For this course, it's very difficult to find it that way. I found this to be easy enough in the axial plane to be able to see the cingulate, you have to know for a test. Longitudinal fissure, have to know for the test. Central sulcus, have to know for the test. Pre-central gyri, post-central gyri, have to know for the test. In an axial plane only. All right, so don't worry about it in a coronal or a sagittal. And we're going to kind of switch back and forth, different ways that we're going to see different anatomy where I will require you to know it in one plane and not so much in the other. And it's because I picked the easiest way for you to see it so that you can see all of the main points, but maybe not necessarily in all different planes. You guys aren't radiologists, you're going to be technologists, and that's, we just need to know the anatomy for our purposes. So let's switch over. The only other thing that I wanted to show you was the lateral fissure, which you can see in a in a coronal, and it's right here actually. It's a good slice. Okay, looking at the lobes in the different view. Here's your lateral fissure. So this is temporal lobe, okay. And then up here, if you're really anterior, if you're super anterior, then you can say without a shadow of a doubt, that's posterior. If you can say without a shadow of a doubt that this is frontal lobes, okay? But then once you get back to a certain point, remember, I'm getting into parietal, but not being a radiologist, I don't know exactly where that transition happens from frontal lobe, anterior, parietal, kind of in the middle. And then definitely once you get to the back here, these are your occipital lobes. Occipital, back here. Okay. And then cerebellum down here. This is cerebellum here. Okay, 2 lobes of the cerebellum. In the sagittal view, as far as the lobes go, sagittal view, you have frontal lobe. Parietal is in here somewhere. This is probably the central sulcus right here. Frontal, parietal. This is definitely occipital, cerebellum here. And then we have to go out laterally to get to our temporal lobe. And then this guy in here is your insular lobe. Okay, that's kind of like what we call air quote 5th lobe right there. Okay, so that's those are the lobes of the brain. The different areas that we've talked about that are in your text. Let me find what page that they're on. I can't remember. There it is, page 103. So when you're kind of here looking at the temporal lobe, you have temporal lobe, you have insular lobe. They kind of show you where the precentral, this is probably it right here, the central sulcus and then the precentral and postcentral gyrus. Again, you don't have to know that. This is lateral fissure. You do have to know that. Okay, frontal lobe is here, temporal lobe is here, occipital lobe is here. This is cerebellum, insular, and then Broca's area. We talked about Broca's area is right here. Okay, that's where your speech and language development takes place, motor, speech, and language. Okay, and that should make sense. Okay, because it's located right near the temporal, which is where the hearing comes in. You have to be able to hear appropriately in order to speak appropriately, or speak what we would consider normal speech. You have to have some ability to hear, and that's where that area is, and that's how it transfers that over to your motor cortex, so that you can hear the speech and then translate that out through actual speaking, through your own ability to speak. So you have to hear and then translate that within your brain and then initiate speech in Broca's area, which is right here. Okay. The optic nerve coming back, which this is kind of getting ahead a little bit to next week, is right here. All right, so what else? Let me look at my notes here. I think we've covered all of that. Gray matter versus white matter. On sagittal, very easy to see. Gray matter, okay, white matter. Gray matter about 3 to 5 millimeters thick. Gray matter is your neuron cell bodies. They are unmyelinated. The myelin is what makes it appear white. Those are going to be the axons. This is where you're going to have your sending of your signals insulated with the myelin, which allows for faster and better sending of signals. So your gray matter is kind of like your little processing centers, and all the white matter is the sending of the signal centers. The largest area of white matter in the body, in the brain rather, is the corpus callosum, and here it is right here. Corpus callosum. Okay, right in the center of the brain. I know I kept saying midbrain in lecture. This is actually midbrain. It has its own terminology. When I was lecturing, I was intending to say like the middle of the brain. So see, that's the middle area, right in the center, because we're not, if I go all the way to the out, to the lateral coming in medially, it's actually in the middle of the brain. Okay. So that's what I meant by that. Don't get confused when we start actually talking about midbrain. All right, so here's your corpus callosum right here. The 4 parts of the corpus callosum you have to know. Rostrum, right here. Genu, right here. Body, and then splenium, right here. Rostrum, genu, body, splenium. Remember, there are 2 spots in the brain where right and left hemispheres can communicate. Because remember, they're separated by the longitudinal fissure. So if you have this huge fissure that separates your 2 hemispheres of your brain, how do they actually communicate back and forth? How do I know, how does the left side of my brain know what the right side of my brain is doing, and vice versa? And it's through the 2 different commissures. The posterior, very, very, very difficult to see. It's like this little teeny guy here. But the anterior commissure, super easy to see. Okay, it's this guy right here. Anterior commissure. It's inferior to the corpus callosum, but it is actually part of the corpus callosum. It has like its own little arm here. Okay, so anterior commissure. It's coming at you because it travels transverse within the brain, side to side, I guess you can say. So anterior commissure, communication between the 2 different hemispheres in the brain. All right, so that's the corpus callosum in a sagittal view. Let's switch over and look at it in an axial. And again, remember, I've switched over to the axial flare, so the gray and white matter is swapped, okay? So I need to get kind of to the middle portion of the brain, and I need to look for the greatest area of white matter in the center, which is right here. Okay, that's the genu of the corpus callosum, and this is the splenium of the corpus callosum. Okay, If I go very inferior, this is kind of like a little slice of the rostrum coming down here. And then one little slice up, this is kind of like a thin slice of the body. Okay, so we're looking at kind of like that little tadpole-like thing that it looks like a tadpole in a sagittal view. When I'm looking at it down from the top or up from the bottom, I'm seeing the body first as a slice, and then I'm seeing the genu and the splenium, and then one little section that kind of moves a little posterior and inferior to the genu is the rostrum. Okay, so that's your corpus callosum in the axial view. We can also see it in a coronal view. Okay, I'll go very anterior, all the way anterior. Here's your inferior posterior portion is your rostrum. Here's your genu. Traveling back, that's kind of like your body, and then this portion here is the splenium. Okay, and then coming off anteriorly, boom, see this? Anterior commissure. That's your right and left hemisphere communication. Okay, one of the only spots. All the way back, it's harder to see. You can't see the posterior. You can see anterior right there. Okay, anterior commissure of the communicates between the right and left hemispheres, and it's located right inferior to the corpus callosum. You can also see it in an axial view. This is it right here, anterior commissure. Communication between right and left hemispheres. Okay. Genu, down, down, anterior commissure. All right, so that is your corpus callosum, the largest area of white matter deep within the cerebral cortex. Next, we have to talk about basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Those are like little islands of gray matter within the brain. Now remember, again, let me remind you, I'm on the flare. So the islands of gray matter actually show up a little bit lighter on this image, okay? So let's first look at the genu of the corpus callosum. So if you look at the genu and then you look on each hemisphere, just posterior to that, right here is your caudate nucleus. Okay, that's one of your islands of gray matter located deep within the cortex. Okay, there's your caudate nucleus. There's going to be a canal, if you will, of white matter separating the two, separating the caudate nucleus from the lentiform nucleus. This is lentiform nucleus. Okay, and then the internal and external spaces here are areas of white matter, or kind of rivers of white matter that separates the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. Okay, so there's your your caudate lentiform nucleus, your basal ganglia of the brain. Capsule, that's what they are. Internal and external capsule. Sorry, I'm calling them fissures. Internal and external capsule. So they're the rivers of white matter separating the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. Okay, so that's how you can see them in the axial view. Caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, internal capsule, external capsule. Genu, splenium of the corpus callosum. Lateral fissure, insular lobe, frontal lobes, temporal lobes, occipital lobes, and then somewhere up here, parietal. Let's switch over to sagittal. Let's look at your caudate nucleus here. In the sagittal view, you have the where are we? Let me find this. All right, here is your lentiform nucleus right here, caudate nucleus right here. Okay, remember they're islands of gray matter, and I've switched back to my T1, so it's actually going to be gray matter. It's actually going to look gray. Okay, lentiform caudate right there. And then the space between internal capsule, your river of white matter separating the lentiform and caudate nucleus. Switching over to, let's switch over to coronal. Anterior commissure right there. And here you have caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, internal capsule, external capsule. Genu. Going posterior splenium. Okay, genu. Caudate, lentiform, internal capsule, external capsule, anterior commissure. All right? So those are your basal ganglia in the 3 different planes that you have to know them. Last but not least, we have the cerebellum. Okay, cerebellum back here. Here's this guy. 2 different hemispheres, right and left hemisphere. Actually, we have to talk about fissures to the meninges. Sorry. So we have the left and right hemispheres of the cerebellum. Okay, the little brain separated by the vermis right here. This is the vermis. Okay, it kind of looks like a vermis, right? Cerebellar tonsils right here. They even kind of look like tonsils. If you look in the back of your throat, they kind of look like that. Cerebellar tonsils, okay? The peduncles are right here, the superior peduncles, right here. Remember, this is where you have that like relay system of your information from the cerebellum up into the frontal lobe, okay? Because remember, the cerebellum does not initiate motor functions, but it is crucial and it's important to coordinate along with the frontal lobe, literally to allow for coordination, swinging of your arms, that kind of stuff, in together. Muscle tone, posture, and coordinating of the right and left of your body. So you're not just like flailing all over when you're walking. There's actually a little bit of coordination in your movements. So fibers that come from the dentate nucleus, which is right in here. You can kind of see this little bit of gray area in here in each hemisphere. That's the dentate nucleus. It comes right in and connects in through these fibers to the peduncles right there, superior peduncles. All right, and then comes in through the thalamus, which is kind of like your relay station for sensory stimuli, going up into the frontal lobe. All right, so that's cerebellum in the coronal, cerebellum in the sagittal. Here you go. Okay, dentate nucleus is in each side, this kind of like fibery stuff, peduncles, tonsils down here. There's the tonsil, right? You can see the dentate nucleus in there. And then if we switch over to the axial, here's your vermis separating right and left hemispheres. Your peduncles up in here, they look a little bit different. And then the tonsils down here. All right, so that's cerebellum. Last but not least, we have the meninges, which very difficult to see the actual meninges, but I do want to show you. If we switch over to sagittal, do you see this like kind of curtain coming down here in between the right and left hemispheres? That's your dura mater, okay? Comes down, double layered down through the longitudinal fissure, separates the different layers of the brain, but it also creates curtains. I guess you could call them curtains that are going to separate certain structures in the brain. So one of the largest folds of the dura mater cushions and separates the right and left hemisphere of the brain. So you have the longitudinal fissure, that big space or large groove in between the right and left hemisphere, and then you have this lining, this double folded lining separating the two, and this is called the falx cerebri, okay, separating it's the actual tent-like material, not tent, I guess, curtain-like material, the dura mater, that separates and cushions the right and left hemisphere. So you can just see it right here on the sagittal slice, okay, perfect. Then you have a separation between your cerebrum and your cerebellum, and that is your tentorium cerebelli. Okay, tentorium cerebelli right here. That's the fold of dura mater separating your cerebrum from your cerebellum. All right, and then last but not least, which you can't really see in this plane, you have, let's switch over to the coronal. In here, you can just kind of see it, the falx cerebri. In here, tentorium, the tent, here's where it looks like a tent, it's in the coronal plane. Tentorium cerebelli, separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then there's another fold of dura mater separating the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. You can kind of see there's a little bit of it coming in here. A little bit of it in there. That's your falx cerebelli. Falx cerebelli separating your right and left hemispheres of your cerebellum. The falx cerebri separating right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum, and the tentorium is the tent separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. All right, so those are your meningeal layers. You're not going to be able to see the arachnoid mater and the pia mater because they're sandwiched in so tight, and the only way you see them is if there's something in the space between them. You can see the dura mater here. Look at that. Okay, nice lining of dura mater. You can even see how it folds down in to the longitudinal fissure to create the falx cerebri. Okay, and then you have cranium here. And the picture in your book, it looks very similar to this right here. Let me find it really quickly. That shows you the different meninges, page 90. If you kind of imagine that this is kind of like your that picture in the book, you can see the dura mater. You can't see the pia and the arachnoid mater, but you can kind of imagine that fold coming down, right, and creating that space, the dural sinus, which we'll talk about when we talk about the vasculature of the brain. All right, so that's it for this week. We will pick up with the ventricular system and talk about the ventricles next week, talk about midbrain, get into some of the glands in the brain, and then we'll talk about the circulation in the brain.